D-Day was the coastal invasion of the Atlantic Wall, specifically in the Normandy region of France. During the battle, the Allies had 133,000 troops and the Axis had 55,000 troops. A common misconception of the Atlantic Wall is that it spans just the coastline of France. However, it does not. As shown on this map, the Atlantic Wall spanned from the tip of Norway to the bottom of France. The wall was meant to stop the Allies from gaining a foothold into Europe, excluding a part of Italy. The Atlantic Wall was even nicknamed Fortress Europe after Hitler ordered its construction on March 23, 1942. Here is a look at the Normandy section of the Atlantic Wall today. In the red highlighted section on the map, we can see the Pas-de-Calais area. This area was over-fortified by the Nazis because of its distance to Great Britain, meaning that the Allies could easily cross the English Channel. This map shows where the German army divisions were located in northwest France. The red dots show the army divisions. As you can see, most of the German army is located at Calais, Paris and Saint-Malo, unlike Normandy, who has very few troops, which would later turn out to be good for the Allies. On this part of the map, we can see a white star and multicolored dots. These dots show where the Allies landed, specifically on the beaches Sword, Juno, Omaha, and Utah. Now let's discuss the troops defending the Atlantic Wall. These troops were inexperienced, too young or too old because of the time during the war, specifically in 1944, where the Nazis' army had experienced many casualties. You can see the inexperienced troops in these images. This would become a problem after the Allies seized the beaches of Normandy because the best troops, the Wehrmacht soldiers and the Waffen-SS, were too far to quickly counterattack to try to stop the Allies' invasion of France. Another flaw of Fortress Europe was that the Enigma machine, as shown here, was already cracked in December 1932 by mathematician Marian Rejewski at the Polish General Staff's Cipher Bureau, and therefore the Allies were able to tell the troops' movements before the battle even started. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, whom you can see in this photo, was the officer in command of the defending troops. While Rommel tried his best to revamp the wall after seeing its problems, Rommel was allocated limited resources. What was so special about Rommel was that he, unlike other high-ranking Nazi officers, believed that the Allies would attack in Normandy instead of Pas-de-Calais. Luckily, the other generals overruled him, and the supplies were concentrated in the wrong place. While the Atlantic Wall had its flaws, the Allies had their flaws too. Firstly, the weather on the English Channel was horrible. Therefore, the boats sometimes went off course or even capsized. Secondly, the massive fleet of naval vessels, airplanes and troops were hard to conceal. Therefore, sometimes information would be leaked, like when a US Army captain who went drinking at a bar told a civilian about the planned invasion. Luckily, this incident never was brought to the attention of Nazi spies. Finally, the Allies had invented something new called a floatable tank. The problems with these tanks were they would almost always sink in the rough waves, or because their flotation devices couldn't hold them up. Even in testing in the quiet lakes of Britain, they still sank. Therefore, when met with the rough waves of the Normandy beaches, they stood absolutely no chance, especially since their job was to make it from the landing raft to the beach. Also, they often hit landmines and were hit with anti-tank weapons from the Nazi defenders. Out of the 290 DD tanks, which these tanks were named, only 2 survived. Therefore, they were nicknamed the Widowmaker. However, one thing the Allies did well was Operation Fortitude. Operation Fortitude's goal was to confuse the Germans by creating a fake army to make the Nazis believe that the invasion would occur in Pas-de-Calais. This fake army consisted of rubber tanks, troops, planes, ships, and more. This army was all commanded by General Patton because the Nazis believed that he was the US's best general and therefore feared him, but Patton was definitely not too happy about this. The Allies began planning D-Day in 1940 after the invasion of Dunkirk, and it was decided by Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, General Eisenhower, and his staff that the troops would depart from the United Kingdom near Exeter to Normandy and attack by boat and ship. The invasion was supposed to take place in March of 1944, where the Allies would cross the English Channel. However, Group Captain, Chief of Meteorology for General Eisenhower, James Stagg, predicted that the weather would be atrocious. Therefore, the date continued to be pushed back till June the 6th, 1944. You may be thinking, why not just have it any day? Well, the Allies needed a full moon, so they could see without the Germans seeing them, and they also needed fog. Before the bombers and the landings began, the paratroopers landed under the command of Matthew Ridgway and Maxwell Taylor, with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Their task was to remove obstacles from the beaches, liberate towns, and destroy any type of artillery that may obstruct the path of tanks. With the paratroopers came gliders. These gliders were meant to provide supplies for the Allies to attack the Germans. The gliders brought jeeps, tanks, small arms, along with paratroopers. However, right when the paratroopers landed, they were met with heavy fire, even if they were able to pass the anti-aircraft guns that took down most gliders. Later, at 2 a.m., the first wave of bombers left Britain. However, the bombs did not hit their targets as intended due to heavy winds and limited visibility because it was 2 in the morning, even with the full moon. So the troops responsible for securing the beaches had more casualties. During the bombings, ships fired away artillery to remove obstacles, but that did not help very much. Now, you may also be asking, why couldn't the Air Force just do this during the day? Well, that may seem like the obvious choice, however, then that would have given the Nazi High Command more time to strategize and reinforce the Atlantic Wall in Normandy. However, just communication isn't that much time. But if the High Command had better communication, they might have had just enough time. But while all this was happening, Rommel was on vacation in Germany and his staff were at the War Games in Rennes, about 3 hours away from Normandy. So less senior commanders had to take their places until they got back. Additionally, since there were so many false alarms of an invasion before, these less senior commanders were even more hesitant about informing the higher-ups. To make matters worse, they would send patrols to check and recheck the place where paratroopers were reported and where bombs went off, and some commanders would just blatantly ignore the warnings. Then the first ground troops landed at 6:30 a.m. and stormed the beaches, but were met with heavy artillery fire, troops, tanks, etc. because the bombs and paratroopers could not remove all the obstacles beforehand. Approximately 4,000 Allied troops lost their lives during the invasion. It took approximately 10 minutes to 2 hours to secure all of 5 landing zones. After the Allies secured the beaches, the Nazis were in retreat. Their goal was to try to hold back the Allies, but they could not. Eventually, as you can see here, the Nazis tried to have a counterattack, but their response was slow and eventually failed. Even Rommel agreed that the battle was lost after arriving at his headquarters. Additionally, many of the best troops, the Wehrmacht, were stationed in Pas-de-Calais and Paris as shown on the map earlier, so they could not stop the Allies as quickly. While the Nazis retreated, they had to break everything that may help the Allies, like tracks, bridges, and all types of infrastructure. Eventually, in about a year, the Canadians, Americans, and British would push from their foothold in France up to Berlin, creating the Western Front. And the Soviet Union would push forward from their homeland to Berlin on the Eastern Front. Soon, the Nazi regime would collapse after many battles, and the country would be divided into East and West Germany until it would become a democracy once more after the collapse of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. But that is for another time. Thank you for watching History Explained, and remember to like and subscribe. While the Nazis retreated, they had to break everything that may help the Allies, like tracks, bridges, and all types of infrastructure. Eventually, in about a year, the Canadians, Americans, and British would push from their foothold in France up to Berlin, creating the Western Front. And the Soviet Union would push forward from their homeland to Berlin on the Eastern Front.